Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the President of the American Council on Germany, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the second edition of Resilience and Adaptation, a new series of events brought to you by 1014 and the American Council on Germany.
And I am Katja Wiesbach-Donovan, Chief Officer at 1014. Each week, we will be joined by experts from both sides of the Atlantic to talk about the present challenges that are now emerging around the globe. The corona pandemic is more than a public health challenge. It is a litmus test for governments around the world. And while it is certainly too early for any final conclusions, we can see that some countries seem to be faring better than others.
Joining us today to talk about the lasting implications for governments in a post-pandemic world are Daniela Schwarzer and Francis Fukuyama. Thank you both for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks to you.
An American Council on Germany Young Leader alum, Dr. Francis Fukuyama is professor of political science at Stanford University. He's a prolific writer and thinker. His book, The End of History and the Last Man Standing, was published in 1992 and has appeared in over 20 foreign editions. And his most recent book is Identity, the Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment. In the course of today's conversation, we will undoubtedly get into some of the topics he raises in these two books. And Dr. Daniela Schwarzer is director of the German Council on Foreign Relations, the DGAP. Previously, she was a member of the executive team of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. And prior to her work at the GMF, she spent 8 years at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, or Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, where she focused on European integration. We'd like to remind everybody that ACG and 1014 are both independent, nonpartisan organizations, and the views expressed during today's discussion are those of the two experts. Also, if you'd like to ask questions, please use the chat function in Zoom or send me a question, and we'll fold it into our conversation today.
So let's start the discussion. Francis Fukuyama and Daniela Schwarzer, you have both analyzed how countries are responding to this unprecedented global crisis. Francis Fukuyama, in a recent interview in the German newspaper, you described the current crisis as potentially becoming worse than the Great Depression. And we have already seen an explosion in unemployment in the United States and elsewhere. What makes this crisis so devastating?
I think that the disease...
You'd like to go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for having me in this discussion. So I think the nature of the disease actually is a combination of characteristics that makes it particularly devastating economically. It apparently is not that lethal. It's not like Ebola, where if you get it, it's a death sentence, which makes people a little bit more relaxed. But on the other hand, it seems to be extremely contagious, again, in contrast to something like Ebola, which means that it's spread around the world extremely rapidly. But it also means that people in many places don't have a kind of sense of urgency that this is really a public health problem that, requires extraordinary measures. And so even today, in the United States, a lot of governors are trying to open up their states despite the fact that, the death rates are continuing to climb because very many people, think, well, I don't have it and I don't see people around me that have it, and therefore it's okay. So cognitively, it's very hard for, I think, populations to wrap their minds around what the real threat of this disease is, which means that it's going to continue, it's going to be very hard to open up, and it means that the economic crisis is going to continue to deepen.
Daniela Schwarzer, do you agree with this assessment that it's so devastating because it's so hard to grasp and to get a hold on? What are your main concerns as you look at this public health and global economic crisis?
Well, thank you, Katja, and thank you, Steve, for having me. It's a real pleasure to be with you in this discussion. I very much agree. The combination of a pandemic, which indeed is hard to grasp, and I can maybe later on talk a bit about the discussion in Germany about reopening and the risk assessments that vary even between different regions within Germany and different people who are in political office. because it is so hard to understand how fast the pandemic can actually come back. So I agree with Francis' analysis. Let me add maybe 2 or 3 points. I guess from a European perspective, the challenge is huge because both with regards to the health crisis and with regards to the economic crisis and potentially a financial crisis, which may fall upon us as well, reactions initially have been mainly national, which is rather normal in a crisis situation that you try to handle and protect your own citizens and constituencies first. However, what we saw was that borders were being pulled up in the European Union, both as a response to the health crisis, but then also economic measures were taken that, if you look at the fundamental principles of the single market, are actually in contradiction to what we think is the right economic order for the European Union. So there is a deeper challenge here also for the arrangement of the European Union, and I'm happy to come to that point when we deepen that question of how Europe gets through this crisis. But what we see is the moment we have incomplete integration, which we definitely have because there is no pan-European health policy and no way to handle this health crisis on the European level rapidly and consistently, that the moment this happens and there is a perception of a threat, nationalist reaction or national reactions come back and nationalist sentiment re-emerges. And I guess that's one of the big challenges that I see for Europe on top of the ones that Francis gave. And my second point, just to give you a number, the European Commission published a forecast today about the depth of the recession, and we all still remember the recession that hit Europe in 2008 and 9, where the economic recession was at around 4.5%. Now the forecast for the Eurozone is 7.7%. So if an economy shrinks to that extent, it means, first of all, of course, huge numbers of job losses. And then secondly, this crisis, the economic crisis, won't hit the EU or the Eurozone in a symmetric way. So the whole issue of divergence and of regions and countries drifting apart will be very much on our political agenda in the course of this year.
Thank you both for helping sort of set the stage. And I'd like to come back to you, Francis. You, of course, have spent much of your career studying political systems. And in a crisis, there are often calls for a strong government. Does this mean that authoritarian regimes are fundamentally better suited to handle a pandemic than liberal democracies? And so I'd like to sort of maybe go back in time, right? We've been dealing with this over the last 3 or 4 months. How have you charted how different governments have managed the situation?
I don't think there's much of a correlation between whether you're democratic or authoritarian and how well you've handled the crisis, because in both categories, there's some countries that have done very well and others that have done very poorly. So among authoritarian states, China, Singapore have managed to get on top of the epidemic, sometimes through means we wouldn't approve, but they've gotten it more or less under control. And then others like Russia or Belarus, Iran have really done very poorly. Same thing with democracies. I think that South Korea, in a way, is kind of the outstanding case where they delegated authority to a woman that was running their centers for disease control. They got on top of it very early, and as a result, they have a much better record than China does, and they're a very good democracy. I think Germany has done well within Europe compared to France and Spain. On the other hand, Britain and the United States have had a terrible record, and so I think it's really not whether you're democratic or not. I think it depends on a couple of other factors. So one is basic state capacity. If you don't have the health infrastructure, if you don't have the kind of trained professionals and expertise, and then the frontline workers to manage the crisis, you're obviously going to be overwhelmed. But then the other important factor is a matter of trust, and that exists on a couple of dimensions. There has to be trust in the government, and that in turn is related both to that state capacity, but also to whether the leaders actually seem to be operating in the public interest in a competent way. And that is really, unfortunately, not present in, for example, in my country. And the other thing has to do with the trust among citizens. And again, one of the terrible things I think that's happened is that in the United States, we are so polarized that the polarization has now taken hold of the response to the epidemic. And so, conservatives for several months, in fact, for the whole period, have been denying that this is a serious issue at all, that it's been overblown by the liberal media. They want to open up the economy, regardless of the real consequences of that. And on the other side, more progressive people have emphasized the public health issues. And so the response is not a socially rational one. It's really tainted by the kind of tribalism that's infected the country as a whole. And I think, you see that in other countries like Italy as well, where you have a lot of criticism and carping against, the government from populists and the like.
So that obviously has a lot to do with how countries have managed the lockdown to begin with. I think many of the things that you were touching on become even more relevant as one thinks about how they start to reemerge and start to open up. Can you talk a little bit about some of your concerns as you look to the future, how these countries will manage that process as well?
Oh, well, there are huge concerns. In fact, they're probably even bigger than the ones having to do with the public health part of the crisis. The US Congress, for example, has now voted for $2.5 trillion of new government spending to support individuals and businesses. And a lot of that authority is going to be very discretionary. Some people are going to get it and other people are not. There's huge opportunities for corruption in this process. And there's huge already distributional issues about who should get the money. Should it go to a big corporation like Boeing, or should it go to small businesses? Who qualifies for assistance? We're already seeing big fights over this kind of issue, and they're going to get worse as time goes on because so much money is really at stake here.
And Daniela, you were talking before a little bit about the rise of nationalism, and I want to come back to that point. You were interviewed by the Süddeutsche Zeitung last month, and the headline was, "In this crisis, authoritarian states are becoming more authoritarian." As you look across Europe and around the world, can you share some examples of this? And do you think that this trend is temporary, or will it be reversed anytime soon?
So if we look at what happens in a country, for instance, like China, where over the past years, a system has emerged which combines authoritarian rule with technology, we can see that the pandemic and the handling of the corona crisis has actually accelerated that trend, because it gave the government, you can call it a need or you can call it an opportunity, to introduce a system which serves to survey citizens in an even closer way. So the net that is put out there to trace movement, to trace contacts, is even more closely knit than the technology employed before. And if we look at the track record, I think there is no reason to assume that this would be undone, even when the pandemic has gone away, unless, of course, citizens resist or revolt, but that is very unlikely because the grip of power over citizens and civil society is ever tougher. So without being able, of course, to read the mind of Chinese leaders, I have no real reason to assume that this would be built back once the health crisis is really managed over the medium and long term. You also asked me to comment on European countries, which, yes, we also need to look at. Today is the day where Freedom House published its latest Nations in Transit report, which is essentially a report that assesses the state of democracy and rule of law. And what it says in this report, and this is not only an effect of the reactions to the corona crisis, but I guess in this case as well, we see an acceleration, So if I quote Freedom House, I can tell you that Hungary is now a hybrid regime, in quotation marks, having lost its status as a semi-consolidated democracy. So what happened once the health crisis hit Europe was that the Hungarian government introduced the adoption of an emergency law, which allows the government to rule by decree. The particular thing here is that there's no time limit set. And so we see this, or we have to see this as looking at it from the outside, as another step of consolidating authoritarian power. So yes, there are examples within the EU as well, and a certain political helplessness to respond to this. We can also see that very often in democracies that are smaller in Europe, but also in Europe's neighborhood, and in particular also on the Western Balkans, you see a combination of fragile or backsliding democracies, where you have authoritarian leaders or leaders with authoritarian traits, and then you have external influence from countries that are actually interested in weakening democracies, either within the EU or on its borders in the neighborhood. So one example where there's a lot of analysis of external influence is Serbia, both from Russia and China. Also, if you look at other countries that are in the eastern neighborhood of the European Union, you see very much the same patterns. So I guess my conclusion here is that authoritarian regimes, in particular when they have an international ambition and power of outreach and strategy, like for instance China has and like Russia has in the EU's eastern neighborhood, they don't only consolidate their own authoritarian systems, but they also use this moment to disturb democratic systems or help or further backsliding in other countries.
So as a follow-up to that, Daniela, we have a question from one of our viewers who writes, is there a chance that social democracies will come out ahead? Northern Europe has done well. Right-wing parties like the AfD or National Front have lost support. You're seeing authoritarian oil countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia weakened, and even China was set back. At the same time, the EU does seem to have stepped it up, committed to preserving the euro, committed to working together to find a vaccine, and even helping countries like Greece, Italy, and Spain. So the question is there any chance of good news?
There's a lot in this question, a lot that's worthwhile discussing, but I'll focus on the question whether liberal was said social democracies can come out stronger than other systems. Of course, there's a chance. And in my view, it will take a while until the jury is out. What we see at the moment, but this is only a short-term reaction, that in many countries, indeed, if you look at opinion poll data, you see a relative strengthening of the political center, often of the parties that are in government, and a weakening of the extremists and the political margins. This is not an unusual effect in a crisis situation, that the political leadership and the more moderate parties actually get more support, and there's little public space also for more radical parties to actually make their points, while everything is really focused on crisis management. If you just look at the daily news shows, you can see that literally 95% or 90% of the news and of the little films are concerned with crisis management. At least in certain periods of the early phases of the crisis, this was the case. Now, I'm saying this as a short-term reaction because in the medium term and in the long term, also European liberal democracies will have to deal with the very deep economic repercussions. And that can be a moment where people reassess the support they have for their governments, where the criticism will grow, both of the handling of the health crisis, but then also mostly the handling of the lockdown and the ensuing economic consequences. Now, I think we are very lucky in Europe to have a combination of a democratic political system, a solid health system in really most of the EU countries, And we can see the advantages this has over, for instance, the United States, where clearly the network or the safety net isn't as robust, far from what we see in many European states. And then also robust social system that can cushion the negative effects for a while. But I wouldn't, dare to judge from today's perspective that all will go well. I think the political ambition is clearly there. Also, and that was in the question as well, yes, Europe is slowly but surely getting its act together. And one of the reasons clearly is that in this crisis, which is as much an internal crisis in each and every single country as it is within the EU, it's also a global crisis. And we see very much how the world, which has been characterized by great power politics for a while, Europe reassesses its own role in the world and needs to make sure for itself that it protects itself better. And I guess that's also one of the drivers why there is, in my view, really an honest dedication to find European answers to the current crises.
Thank you very much. This seemed to be good news. And Francis Fukuyama, would you agree with Daniela's take on where Europe is heading, or do you have a different opinion on how Europe is gonna come out of this crisis?
Well, I think I generally agree. I think that the longer the economic crisis goes on, and I think it is going to go on for quite a while, the more dangerous it becomes, because over time you get these delayed backlash effects that you don't feel, during the crisis itself. If you think about the previous crises we've had, the Great Depression, or the financial crisis in 2008, or September 11th. I mean, a lot of the long-term effects were completely unanticipated when the crisis first began, and so I think we have to be prepared for that. I would say that in a certain sense, in Europe, this has continued to widen the gap that was revealed during the Euro crisis between the North and the South of Europe. And I think that that gap is going to continue and maybe even to widen, because there's just more social consensus in Northern Europe. The governance institutions are stronger, state capacity is better, and that means that there's going to be this continuing tension over responses, and whether Northern Europe has the obligation to bail out weaker countries in Southern Europe. So I imagine that is going to be the chief issue that will be on the table as we proceed into the economic part of this this moment.
Yeah. May I just add a point which I think is really important to what Francis just said?
Absolutely.
Okay, so because you spoke about the North-South divide and the danger that this divide is actually deepened, and I think you're absolutely right. First of all, there was immediately politically, the Eurozone was divided over the question, how should an economic recovery fund or rescue package, whichever name you give it, should be built? Should it be based on a joint mutual debt, or should it be based on national contributions? How much volume should there be? And should the EU hand out loans or grants? And of course, depending on the respective national situation, you will have very different needs, because if you give Italy, for instance, lots of loans, this adds to public debt, and this is then obviously more destabilizing than in other country cases. But there's also not only the question of how do you arrange the European recovery instruments in the way that they don't strengthen divergence, but rather work for more convergence. That's the big question, and that's the question of really shared European interests that the EU as a whole is just about to answer, because the European Commission has been tasked to put out this big proposal on building a recovery fund and linking it to the EU budget. But the second dimension is very much the national responses. And one of the questions, of course, is which how big is the fiscal space that a single country has? And the divergence here is just huge. If you look at numbers that came out over the weekend, out of all subsidies that governments have put out as a reaction to the corona crisis nationally, 52% all across the EU are German subsidies to German recipients. So, of course, Germany has the fiscal space to do so, and it's absolutely understandable that the government does this, but the German economy is just 27% of the Eurozone, so you see the mismatch here. And while it is politically legitimate, absolutely explicable, and clear that this happens, the repercussions of this will be a driver of divergence, and this needs to be taken into account and makes the debate even more difficult, how we can build a European response that enhances convergence and not divergence.
If I could also just add, you know, you have a north-south divide, but you also have the east-west divide that you mentioned earlier, where you've got countries like Serbia and Hungary that are moving in politically in a very authoritarian direction. And my sense is that, you know, Europe is just too focused. I mean, the countries in Western Europe are too focused on their own problems right now to really pay that much attention. I mean, I don't really understand what seems to me Hungary ceased being a consolidated liberal democracy way before, you know, this crisis. But dealing with that and with Chinese influence in that region, I think is also going to be something that will continue to, you know, to divide Europeans.
Yeah, I don't want to sideline our moderators, but just one additional thought on that because it's of key importance. Indeed, I guess my judgment would be that European governments have missed an opportunity early on with regards to Hungary, to some extent also with regards to Poland, to work against the deconstruction of democracy and rule of law and so on. Now is a new opportunity because one of the discussions that Europe will be facing is whether with the new recovery instruments and the financial means that are being built, conditionality should be introduced. And my advice, of course, would be to make the disbursement of recovery fund money contingent on the respect of democracy and rule of law. And that would also make it far easier from a political legitimacy perspective in those countries that are more on the donor side than on the recipient side of those mechanisms, if you do the sort of bottom line of it all, that you can say, we are also using this to reaffirm the founding principles of the European Union. And I really think if we miss this opportunity now, by putting out huge sums of money, not linking them to fundamental principles that the EU, all EU member states signed when they became members, this would be a real political failure on the side of the EU.
Thank you so much. And I think German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas has already kind of thought in this direction to link the recovery funds to certain conditions. But Germany will take over the rotating presidency of the EU in July. And just to finish up this discussion on Europe, what would be your advice for Germany? Your final thoughts?
Well, it is a Corona presidency, as our foreign minister has also said, so very much driven by the immediate needs of both crisis management, because in the second half of this year, the presidency will start on July 1st. We will still be facing a public health crisis, maybe a second wave coming back. You know, forecasts say this might be in October, but it could be earlier, it could be later. So the health dimension will still be there, but then also the recession, the economic downturn will be fully felt, and it could possibly even lead to a financial crisis. And so crisis management will be big, but as we learned from the management of the, in particular, sovereign debt and banking crisis in the years 2010 and after, crisis management also always gives you the opportunity, but also the need to think about the medium and long-term consequences of the actions you take. Because as we are facing a new kind of crisis, in this case, the health one, we have to invent the mechanisms and the instruments as the crisis is being managed. And so the opportunity here is, again, to combine short-term measures that need to be taken with longer term thinking where we actually want to take the European Union. If you look at the reforms or the new instruments and the new regulation that were actually built into the economic setup of the European Union once the financial crisis spilled in from the US in 2008. So if you look at the 7 years following that spillover moment, the EU really changed a lot and to the better. And I guess this is now the same challenge again. We know there's still open business with regards to consolidating the Eurozone and the economic governance setup of the EU as a whole. There's the health dimension. But here we have something new which we didn't face 10 years ago, and that is under the impression of the health crisis, the single market was actually fragmented, as I said in my very first take. And the German presidency has already said it will be one of its priorities to bring back a functioning single market. And that is only possible if, as we reintroduce cross-border mobility and contacts, that some European measures to protect are also there. Otherwise, this will not work.
So we're getting a lot of questions from people via email and via the chat function. Many of them focus on Europe. And so I'd like to ask maybe one more question about Europe and then widen the aperture and get to other continents like China and talk a little bit about multilateralism as well. So one of the questions that's come in, and Daniela, this might be a question for you, is does the recent German court ruling questioning some aspects of the ECB's QE program shift the burden of a substantial European response to the fiscal side of the ledger? Do you expect progress in the near term by EU governments on various options like a recovery fund or the use of the ESM? And similarly, the question from another viewer is, will Chancellor Angela Merkel be able to take the necessary steps, including Corona bonds or a form of debt mutualization, to convince the German public that the collapse of the European market for its exports might take place if one does not provide this kind of aid and support? So obviously lots of Germany-focused questions around Germany's leadership role at this time. We can't hear you. Yeah.
Sorry. Yes, I mean, there were several questions, and I guess the bottom line of them all is the relationship between monetary policy and fiscal policy in crisis management. There's a legal aspect, but actually the court ruling is more interesting also with regards to how the European level and the national level relate to each other. I'll come to that in a minute. But again, we see a pattern that is not unknown to us if we have observed the past decade in Europe when it comes to handling a macroeconomic crisis. So the European Central Bank, as the only real federal player in this whole game, has taken the lead when the sovereign debt and banking crisis hit. And again, after a small hiccup, the ECB again stepped in this crisis now. But it is absolutely clear that both the ECB is reaching its limits and governments need to recognize their responsibility to do more on the budgetary side. Now, there has been quite some progress, which again, it didn't start well. If we remember that a few weeks ago, there were meetings, Eurogroup meetings, European Council meetings, which basically led to nothing except for public dispute, also in the conversations afterwards. We now are in a situation where essentially a four-pillar program or a four-pillar setup of instruments has been agreed upon. Three are already pretty much hammered out. It's the European Investment Bank taking a certain role. There is a new kind of, let's call it a European unemployment insurance scheme that was set up to help in particular those countries that do not have the necessary tools themselves to deal with temporary unemployment. And now there is a final big task to solve, and that's the recovery fund, which I mentioned earlier. Now, the European Council tasked the European Commission to come forward with a proposal, not only for the recovery fund, but also for the question, how do we link this to the multi-annual financial framework of the EU, which is essentially this sort of 7-year budget framework, which also has to be concluded under the German EU presidency in the second half of this year. So one of the points in the series of questions was where is Germany ready to go with regards to, and the term was dropped, Corona bonds. I think we have to look at this discussion in a very sober way. Europe will need huge amounts of money, and this money has to be raised somewhere. Of course, you can just build a mechanism through national contributions, or you can lift the own resource system of the European Union, but that will probably not do the trick. And it wouldn't be the most, sort of from an economic perspective, most efficient way to raise money. The European Union already has a number of ways to raise money in the markets as the EU. One example, just to quote one instrument, is our so-called balance of payment loans, which can be given to countries which have a balance of payment problem in the single market. They get loans that the EU gives them, and it has raised the money in the market before it hands them out. So something of this kind, and call it a Corona bond or not, makes a lot of sense. And I think if you look at the other options, how else you could get money to pay for this, there could be some movement to include or use the legal base that we already have and use these instruments to hand out the money. There's also one idea on the table, which was in a very interesting Spanish concept, which the government put forward, and that's the idea of perpetual bonds, basically meaning you give out a bond, but you don't define a date where it has to be paid back. This, it doesn't sound like, if it's not a fairy tale, but it's actually a financial instrument which has been used in post-war Europe, including in the UK, very effectively. So you hand out the bonds, you pay interest, but there is no end date to this. Of course, you can then decide to set an end date later on, but it would lift this huge burden of having to repay debt. This is nothing that, to my knowledge, but those negotiations are actually ongoing the moment we speak. Nothing that the German government has publicly endorsed, but again, I think it's a financial instrument which makes a lot of sense. And as we are talking about huge amounts of money, like 1.5 trillion also for Europe, this is, we need to look at all options. Of course, the German concern will always be risk minimization, and that, has a political component, but it also has a legal component. The German Constitutional Court over the past years had to rule on several of the Eurozone rescue mechanisms, and the question was, in many cases, do the instruments that are used, do those instruments limit the budgetary authority of our parliament, and hence the parliament's sovereignty in deciding over German budgetary affairs? And does it impede democratic legitimacy? And those questions can, of course, come back if there is no careful handling of the question, how far do we go in terms of risk sharing? But I'm convinced there are ways to find this, to define this in a way that is compatible with our constitution. Final point on the court ruling that came out yesterday. I mentioned that maybe the most interesting point, in addition to playing the ball back to governments to do more fiscally, is really the question to what extent the German Constitutional Court can actually rule on ECB programs, because initially the decision was handed on to the European Court of Justice, which ruled and then gave it back to Karlsruhe, to our Constitutional Court. And now Karlsruhe asks the ECB to be more transparent on the bond purchasing program, and lay open its considerations with regard to the adequacy of the means it uses, And here the question is really out whether the ECB will actually respond to the German Constitutional Court, or whether it will just say this is a national ruling, but we are not accountable to the German Constitutional Court, which should only rule on the question of constitutional compatibility within Germany.
Thank you, Daniela. I'd like to switch gears now and talk specifically about China. You've each touched on China a little bit and what's going on in China. But Francis, I'd like to ask you about China's role on the world stage. Obviously, China has been leading humanitarian relief campaigns and sending medical equipment and protective gear to countries in need. It's used its soft power, undoubtedly in an attempt to distract from the fact that the virus originated in Wuhan and that Chinese authorities were not fully transparent at the outset. But what do you think China's end game is?
Well, I, first of all, think that China was handed this huge propaganda opportunity by the fact that, people are really not comparing democracies as a whole to authoritarian states as a whole. What's first in their mind is how's China doing compared to the United States, the two leading representatives of both of those camps, and the difference couldn't be more stark. And so I think, it's really the American failure that has made, democracy as a whole look bad, and the Chinese are doing everything that they can to capitalize on that. However, I'm not sure that this is going to be a lasting advantage for them, because there is, in fact, a whole lot of anger around the world that this virus originated in China. They have been honest about it, and just sending, masks and protective gear, doesn't make up for this, fundamental fault that they continue to bear. So I think that, we'll see a evolution in, its relative prestige. Honestly, I think in the future, what's really going to matter for China's position is whether they can actually open up their economy more rapidly and get people back to work more effectively than Western countries. So far, they look like they're doing that, and I think that what that means is it's going to accelerate the trend that was very evident before, which is a shifting of the center of global economic activity, from this trans-Pacific, transatlantic nexus to one that's based on Eurasia. However, there's a lot of things that, we don't really know how they'll play out. So the Belt and Road Initiative, I think right now is in a lot of trouble because a lot of the recipients of Chinese lending, the Chinese tend to lend to very risky countries. They don't really evaluate these risks on a commercial basis. There's a strong political dimension to their calculations, and they're now overextended in a lot of places in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America that basically are not going to be able to repay. They're probably not even going to be able to keep up with the interest, much less actually repay the loans. And so China is going to face a big question of default on a lot of that portfolio, and then it means that there's going to be a lot of ill will as projects are canceled and so forth. So I just think it's a little bit early to figure out what the real impact is. But I do think that one important thing has happened under Xi Jinping in the last few years, that prior to his rise, the Chinese were not that interested in promoting their model. They did say there's a China model, it's very successful, we're very happy about it, but they didn't try to pretend that this was something that was appropriate globally and seek to export it. And I think that now, as a result of the use of nationalism to cement Xi Jinping's role, they've increasingly seen their own model as something that is available for export. And they've been trying to insert their influence in other countries, including in many democracies, in new ways. I mean, we see this all over the United States, for example, in universities, where if you try to invite a speaker from Tibet or somebody that wants to speak on the incarceration of 1 million Uyghurs, immediately you'll be deluged with petitions from Chinese so-called students, that object to denigration of China. And I think, this sort of thing is on the increase, and I think this crisis is providing more opportunities for that exercise of global influence.
So let me follow up on that. I mean, you were talking a little bit about China's attempts to export its model, if you will, under Xi. What are your thoughts on whether or not and how China strives for global leadership?
Well, it's on a variety of dimensions. I think that they're now, the main instrument really was, I think, the fact that it could support these infrastructure projects around the world. And it was a very nice contrast that China is actually building things that people find useful, whereas the United States exports military equipment and, armies and this sort of thing. But, there is a actual geopolitical dimension to this. I think Europeans tend not to follow things like the South China Sea nearly as much as Americans do. But, last year, at the beginning of last year, Xi Jinping gave a speech in which he basically said, well, we are going to reincorporate Taiwan one way or another within the next decade. And he certainly did not rule out, military means for doing it. So I do think that as the military balance shifts, as China's self-confidence grows, the likelihood that you could actually have, conflict involving China at some point, probably in East Asia, I think has been growing. And so that's another dimension. It's not just the soft power, economic power dimension of Belt and Road. I think there's a harder side to that influence as well. And by the way, the other area obviously is Huawei and technology and 5G and all of that stuff. And I will just say this outright: I think it is crazy for any democratic country to allow Huawei or any other big Chinese company to build its fundamental communications infrastructure, because I just think that in the long run, there is no independent private sector in China. These are basically all under the control of the Chinese state. And, in a future crisis, I think people will really regret that kind of dependence on China.
Thank you, Francis. Daniela, do you have any thoughts on China?
Well, first of all, I very much agree with Francis' analysis. And so maybe let me not contradict at all, but add a European angle. For 5G, I fully agree to the risks that building future infrastructure with that provider, which we know is very much influenced, at least to say the least, by the Chinese government. You open the door either for blackmail, sabotage, or espionage, whatever you think is the most likely risk. But definitely, I don't think you can protect yourself very well if you create more dependencies here than we have already. Interestingly, Europe is divided on that issue. We see different strategies in different countries, and the big discussion that we are now having is, of course, whether we can come up with a European provider or let's say a Western provider, including, of course, cooperation with the United States in an amount of time which, from a business perspective, is okay. And that's, I guess, one urgent answer which policymakers need to give, but it also shows you the fact that we are in this situation is an evidence of the fact that politically China was underestimated for a very long time. And now Europe is really reviewing its own strategy vis-a-vis China. Of course, China is a hugely important business partner for many EU member states, both in terms of exports and imports. Value chains go back and forth. And in particular, from a German perspective, we have a huge export and import dependency, both on China and the United States. So the conflict between the US and China is not at all easy to handle from a European perspective, because obviously in terms of military alliance, in terms of convergence of political systems and so on, it's very clear where Europe is. But in terms of economic dependencies that have been created, it is very hard for Europe to side with the US against China if that were the choice. And I guess over the past month or even years, Europeans, in particular Germans, hoped that they don't have to side so the conflict doesn't escalate and it's possible to balance a triangular relationship in a good way. But the more, again, this current crisis which we are facing and its economic repercussions also amplifies the conflict between the US and China. This will be one of the major topics that Europe will have to solve. And as I said, in many regards, it's absolutely clear where at least the vast majority of EU member states stands. And that is in the Western camp, and it should be that way. But again, the question is, how can Europe have its own say in handling the relationship with China? And is it possible, in particular in view of the upcoming US elections and the possible next administration, to find a constructive approach, constructive transatlantic approach to deal with China, which can't, from a European perspective, only consists in decoupling. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're getting close to the end of this discussion, but we also have a couple more questions from viewers. And one is focusing on globalization.
Katja, we can't hear you. So Katja seems to have frozen, so perhaps I'll ask the question. Or Katja, do you want to try?
I'm just talking.
We couldn't hear you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'm back? Okay, sorry. So the connection was disrupted for a minute. So Francis Fukuyama, just very quickly, this crisis has demonstrated how interconnected our economies are, and it has caused huge disruption in the supply chain and all of this. Do you think that we are in a period of deglobalization, or are we just gonna snap back to where we have been maybe a few years ago?
Well, I don't think there's any chance we're just going to snap back. I think that, in the period up till the crisis, there had been a big emphasis by policymakers and by companies to maximize, production efficiency. And if you could get a, slightly lower wage rate by moving your production to some other country, you would do it. And there was not really much attention paid to resilience. To withstand a shock like a pandemic or a trade war or, other things that we've seen over the last few years. And so I do think that it's going to be very difficult to imagine that the world will simply go back to a situation where countries are that exposed. I don't think you can reverse the fundamental division of labor around the world, given the economic consequences of really pulling back. But I do think that there's going to be a search for ways to make both companies and countries more resilient, by broadening the base of, where your supply chains are located. Some of it will be brought back, domestically, but that is going to be a value that, has not been emphasized in the past, and I think it will in the future.
So interestingly enough, we've spent nearly an hour together and we've not really talked about the United States. The United States was on the list for Katja and I, but we have a question from Bundestag member Andreas Nick, one of your former students, Francis, at SAIS. And he asks a question which I would like to pose to each of you in closing. Will historians look back at the corona crisis and see it as a major accelerator of the decline of US global leadership, both in terms of crisis management, but also in terms of credibility and international commitment? Daniela, would you like to go first?
Well, I dare say from a European perspective, the jury is out and much will depend on November 3rd. This current administration clearly has retreated deliberately and after having announced it from international global leadership, and in handling the pandemic, this has become even more obvious. But I don't think, you know, whoever runs the next US government, the pendulum will swing fully back to previous times, but I do think there will be, in the case of a democratic president, there will be a different approach and different understanding with regards to the mutual interest and win-win that international cooperation entails for both sides. And that's why I think we will know better, you know, at the end of this year. But I think this current situation shows us, because on the one hand, yes, there is a retreat from international connections to some extent, but at the same time, we see that we won't be able to do away with all interdependencies, and we need transnational and international governance approaches to deal with transborder problems. And the pandemic is just one, climate change is the next pressing issue. So I think there is a very full transatlantic agenda, and if the US wishes to come back to a global leadership role, Europe and the US can do a lot to improve the current situation.
And of course, multilateralism is another topic that we just skimmed the surface on. So obviously there's a lot more that we could talk about. But Francis, we'd like to give you the last word to give us your thoughts on US leadership on the world stage and where things stand now, but also looking into the future.
You know, I actually just published a piece in the American Interest earlier this week about American political decay, which was actually fairly pessimistic. So I think in the short run, Biden's chances of being the next president have gone up enormously. You know, the incompetence of the current administration in handling the pandemic, you know, is pretty evident for everyone to see. And so I think it's quite possible that he will win and the Democrats will retake the Senate. And so they'll have control of all three of those branches of government. But, you know, the deeper problem in the United States is really its polarization. So even if that electoral victory happens, there's still going to be 35–40% of the country that is, you know, still committed to kind of a populist agenda. They're going to be very resentful. Some of them are armed. I mean, there's a lot of tension, you know, that you can see in these anti-shutdown protests and anger that's simmering just below the surface. And you know, if you have a Democrat running the country after January, they're going to face a massive budget deficit, many constraints on what they can do. So I would say that we're not out of the woods, even under those circumstances, although certainly you can't even begin to talk about recovering international institutions, you know, without that happening.
Thank you both.
Daniela Schwarzer and Francis Fukuyama, a big thanks to you both for this extremely thought-provoking and lively discussion. It was really super wonderful. And on behalf of 1014 and the American Council on Germany, thank you so much. So hopefully, you know, we'll convene in person at some point in time, but for now, thank you. It was great to do it this way on Zoom.
Okay, thank you very much.
Indeed.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks to both of you for joining us today, to the east of us and to the west of us. To our viewers as well, though, thank you for joining us and for participating with all of your great questions. I'm sorry that we could not include all of them, but I think we tried to incorporate a number of them. You can join us next Tuesday for a discussion about globalization with Torsten Benner from the Global Policy Institute in Berlin and Shannon O'Neill from the Council on Foreign Relations here in New York. And until next time, everybody, stay well.
Thank you.